I just came back from my first trip to China. If you've never been, you have to really see it in person. It's a fascinating place. The people are amazing. Everything is larger than life. The food is incredible. I mean, where's that Chinese food here? Please tell me. But also the pollution is incredible. There's a lot of cars. There's a lot of coal. The sky in the cities looks like it has sort of a permanent Instagram brown filter on it. My husband called it a scene out of Soylent Green. It reminded me of growing up here, a long time ago in California when the air quality was so bad in high school, my coach wouldn't let us run cross country some days. So China wants to be a leader in electric cars, and it has to be. And it has the full power of the state because the state has all the power to make that happen. California has a lot of power too, but we also have a lot of freedom, the freedom to innovate, to invest, to own, to profit. And power is the topic of our panel today. How do we get enough energy? How do we keep it clean enough that we don't destroy industry? How do we create jobs? How do we create things out of the very thing we're trying to reduce, carbon emissions? You're going to hear about the potential of creating products or fuel that have a negative carbon footprint. Prepare yourself for the possibility of a carbon deficit. We're going to get the very latest from SoCal Edison on how they're trying to meet California's ever more stringent regulations. You're going to hear from a company in Orange County that is taking methane and turning it into plastic. It's like sci-fi stuff. But first, we're very lucky here to have so many great research institutions. Professor Harry Atwater is the Howard Hughes Professor for Applied Physics and Materials Science at Caltech. Among his many talents, he's an expert at solar energy conversion. He's also a director at the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis Energy Innovation Hub. Thank you. Thank you. I worked in the car all the way down on that. He's going to tell you about some interesting results from research that shows that they can do artificial photosynthesis, so synthesizing photosynthesis, if you will. And I think I have it right. You can make sort of like a fake plant that takes the CO2 out of the air and turns it into energy. It is crazy science stuff. Let's welcome Professor Harry Atwater.
Energy, you can get it by damming up a river. Energy, a windmill can make the breeze deliver. But even with milling and damming, our needs are so much more demanding.
Okay, well, so it's my great pleasure to tell you about an exciting research initiative coming out of the research laboratories around the state of California, focused on a new emerging science and technology innovation called artificial photosynthesis. That means creating fuels from sunlight along with water and carbon dioxide. And so this view of the Earth here tells you, first of all, a couple things. It tells you how vast is the potential of solar energy. It tells you how large is the energy challenge, the size of the Earth, but it also illustrates that the Earth is finite. So in 2015, as the world's leaders were meeting in Paris to agree on voluntary caps on carbon dioxide emissions, and also to make plans for research investment on energy innovation, carbon-free energy innovation, this fellow from Seattle published a white paper that basically expressed where we have to go in the next 30 years in terms of the carbon intensity of energy, the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. That's on the y-axis of this plot. And basically you see all the curves go down. The blue curve is the curve that you have to follow if you actually want to uphold what the world's leaders agreed to in Paris at the COP21 plot. So in the next 30 years, we have to drive the carbon intensity of our world economy, our energy economy, effectively to zero. Now the dashed lines are what the new capacity has to have in order to meet the 2-degree scenario, the COP21 climate accord goal. So basically that's telling you something that's near impossible, that within 3 years' time, all of our new capacity for energy generation has to be carbon-free. So what that's telling you actually is that we need to decarbonize as quickly as possible, electrify everything that we can, but we're also going to need to have ways to transform carbon dioxide, because we're going to, as a species, as a civilization, create too much of it. So we're going to have to be able to find a way to recycle it. So the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis is creating fuels from carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. This is an integrated partnership led by Caltech with great research institutions from the state of California. Lawrence Berkeley Labs, SLAC National Accelerator Lab in Stanford, UC Irvine, and UC San Diego. It's supported by the Department of Energy, and it's focused on a very audacious objective to close the CO2 cycle, to be able to take CO2 emissions that are now just a global warming gas ever rising in our atmospheric levels, and to capture and recycle CO2 and create useful products, fuels, chemicals, and materials. That means taking solar energy and catalysis and putting it together to create new transformations for CO2. So why are we focused on fuel? So if you look at where the 10 gigatons of carbon emissions that the world is emitting nowadays is coming from, it's coming overwhelmingly from fuels. There's some that's coming from changes in our land use and manufacturing and so forth. But if you think about if we want to recycle carbon, we have to recycle it back to something that has market value. We can't just sequester it and say that we're going to pay for that with money that we don't have enough of to invest to recycle carbon on this scale. We have to be able to produce something of remunerative value. And so the things that have that scale are fuels. We also have other things like materials like concrete, chemicals, some chemicals that reach this scale, but that's why our focus is on fuels. So let's talk about fuels. Some of you, since you're eating lunch, you're probably not eating a jelly donut, but you're having something that might be the chemical equivalent of a jelly donut. So let's compare the energy density in chemical fuels. Why do we make chemical fuels, and why, in many ways, are they superior to batteries? So we should electrify everything that we can in the economy, but how many of you here flew here today? A lot of people drove, but some people flew. Did you fly on an electric-powered airplane? Probably not. And I will safely bet a substantial fraction of my inheritance that you won't do that anytime soon. So there are going to be certain parts of our economy that are going to be almost impossible to decarbonize. So for those, we're going to have to develop renewable fuels. So let's illustrate the chemical energy density. So your jelly donut is 400 calories. So to a chemist, that's 400 kilocalories. And in MKS units, that's 1.7 megajoules. But okay, so what does that mean? Let's do this in terms of something that's equivalent to your laptop battery. So laptop battery is 45 watt hours, which basically tells you that I need about 10 of these laptop batteries to have the energy equivalent. If I could take this energy, chemical energy density, that's very densely stored in this jelly donut, create electricity or other forms of energy from it, you can see the energy density advantage. That's why we power our current vehicles with liquid fuels. That's why we power airplanes with liquid fuels. That's also why you don't eat laptop batteries for lunch. So why solar? So we're talking about taking solar energy. Solar energy is truly a Moore's Law energy technology. So over the time, the last 35 years or so, the price of solar panels have dropped by more than a factor of 100. In fact, as of today, about a factor of 200. And there's been a similar exponential rise in the manufacturing capacity. Today, we have a solar manufacturing capacity of about 60 gigawatts. To give you an idea of scale, that's the world's largest optoelectronics industry. The solar panel industry just surpassed the flat panel display industry in volume. It's within sort of a factor of the entire merchant semiconductor industry worldwide. So it's a big industry, and it has become a big industry very quickly. The costs have dropped even in the last year. If you haven't been paying attention in the last year, your information is out of date. Solar panels have dropped by a factor of 2 in the last year. Think of any other energy technology that has done that. So why catalysis? So think about the potential for catalysis to create a global revolution. And let me remind you that in the 1930s, Fritz Haber and Rudolf Bosch created a process that essentially has allowed us to get the planet to feed a population at the scale of 7 billion people. It's the largest chemical production, other than fuel production, that we do worldwide, which is to create fertilizer. We do it by taking hydrogen from natural gas and nitrogen from the atmosphere in a high pressure and high temperature process. It's quite energy intensive, but we are so dependent on the fertilizer for growing food for the world's crops that we do this at a very large scale. Today, in JCAP, the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis, we have developed devices that create hydrogen with 10% efficiency, and that number is increasing all the time, using solar cell-like absorbers, earth-abundant materials as catalysts, and membranes that separate the fuel products, hydrogen and oxygen, so you don't have a crossover or explosion, and so it's a very safe energy generation process. We're now working on ways to create carbon dioxide and reduce this to fuels and chemicals. There's many different ways of doing this, using heat, electrons, light, and bugs, bioorganisms like bacteria. In JCAP, we're focused on electrocatalysis and photocatalysis, and these are things that allow us to leverage the learning and knowledge base of the photovoltaic industry that's had this exponential cost drop, the abundance of sunlight, and the power of catalysis. So let me just leave you with the notion that today's CO2 emissions tell us that the world will need negative carbon emissions. This is a sobering reality. It is a challenge for science. It's a challenge for California. JCAP, a California partnership advancing artificial photosynthesis, is developing a disruptive alternative to combine CO2 with water and sunlight to produce fuel and chemicals. And while the research is at an early stage, it's pointing towards a possible future where we can use this process, somewhat like the way we use sunlight to generate electricity, to use sunlight using this process called artificial photosynthesis to make fuels and chemicals to close the CO2 cycle. Thanks very much.
Harry, before you go, a couple of quick questions. If the research continues and bears results, how many years before this is marketable, scalable?
Right. So that's a really good question. This is research. It's supported by the Department of Energy. For hydrogen, we are now at a point where I think we have made prototypes that are ever increasing in efficiency. Within, say, 5 or 10 years, with a concerted effort, I think we could see manufacturable, scalable solar panel-like hydrogen generators. For carbon dioxide, the time scale is going to be longer. It's still a challenge. It's a basic challenge for chemical science.
And how's your federal funding?
Well, I can say that despite the fact that we have more than 100 enthusiastic researchers who have committed their careers to this, the Trump administration recommended zeroing out funding for this initiative that was started prior to the Trump administration.
So that's it?
Well, no. I think what we're going to see is that work is going to continue worldwide. California, I think, needs to do its part, both to spur the federal investment, but also through other channels, philanthropic investments and corporate research investments in this area.
Harry Atwater, thank you very much. Appreciate it. SoCal Edison is working very hard to meet California's really stringent regulations, reducing carbon emissions 40% from 1990 standards by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Meantime, we hear stories where we have excess solar power that's not getting used. So what do you do with the infrastructure? Who pays for it? Taxpayers, ratepayers, some of us, or both. That is Caroline Choi's job. She's the Senior VP for Regulatory Affairs, and she's going to come up here right after this video.
Electric Avenue. And then we'll take it higher.
So, how do we solve climate change? It's one of the issues that California is grappling with. And it's certainly a complicated question and one that we understand has some controversy around it. At Southern California Edison, we've created a pathway that we think for California can help solve that question. Clean the power grid and electrify. You know, if we want to take a stand against climate change, improve air quality, we have to stop depending on carbon. Cars, trucks, our water and space heating, electricity. We all have to move away from carbon in order to solve this problem. And California is a prime example of why, right? The state has two of the world's busiest ports. We have goods movement going throughout the region. We have buildings using natural gas for water and heating. And of course, we're depending on our cars to get around. So not that many people flew here, so I'm assuming many of you drove here today. And of course, all that leads to some of the worst air quality in the nation. I saw some of the statistics here at lunch, and we are not on a great list here where we have 8 of the 10 cities in California that are on the worst air quality in the country. So asthma, hypertension, sleep deprivation, cancer, these are all health risks that are associated with poor air quality. So literally, as we're driving from work, we're making our neighbors sick. So fortunately, we live in a state that's really taken on this issue and has set a goal around this, and we have big steps to make by 2030. Jane mentioned that, right? 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. 12 years to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from where we are today. And we've done an incredible job. So since 1990, 9.5 million people have moved into the state of California, and we've kept our greenhouse gas emissions pretty much at that level. So we went up, and now we've really dropped down. So excellent work, really deserve a pat on the back for that. And then we have a lot more work to get to that 40% reduction. And if we reach that goal, then it sets us up well for the 2050 goal of 80% reduction. And so the question is that we grapple with as an electric company is how do we get there in an affordable, sustainable way that's good for the economy and that's good for you and me. And that's, we need new ideas, new partnerships, new innovation, new infrastructure, a whole lot of support from the industries in this room and across the economy, as well as the government, to provide the practical alternatives to carbon. And at Southern California Edison, we believe electricity can be that affordable pathway to that carbon future, low carbon future. And there's a practical reason why. So we know that if we ever want to get to zero emissions, eventually we have to, as I said, replace many of the things that we rely on today that use combustion of fossil fuels. And so we took a close look at all the sectors of the economy, because one thing that California has done is kind of take a siloed approach. We thought it was really important as we move to the 2030 levels to look at it in a more comprehensive way. We took a look at all the sectors of the economy and to see which had the highest greenhouse gas emissions, and so how to go after the ones that have the most cost-effective ways of reducing GHG emissions. And the largest contributor, as you can see here, is transportation. And it's almost 40% of California's greenhouse gas emissions today. That's followed by the electric sector, and then you can see the industrial, commercial, residential sectors trail not too far behind. So clearly you can't go to any one sector and say, hey, no more carbon for you, buddy, find another way, because any one sector can't take the burden of where we need to go in California. We need to do it in the most effective, economical, and integrated way going forward over the next 12 years. So I think we can make this work if we all pull together. For electric utilities, we see a need to go to higher levels of clean energy. If we can create an electric generation mix that's 80% clean energy by 2030, anything that uses that energy is also clean. So that means more solar, more wind, more hydropower, more energy sources that have zero emissions. So right now, for instance, in Southern California Edison, about 40% of the energy that we deliver to customers is zero carbon. And that's actually not that unusual for the state of California. But we have to double that in the next 12 years, and we believe that's absolutely doable. And that's the clean power part of our pathway. So now if we look at electrification, transportation is clearly a big target there with almost 40% of the GHG emissions. So the logical thing to do there is to transition to electricity and plug into that 80% clean energy I just mentioned and literally use the Earth's resources to propel us forward, using zero emissions energy to power zero emission vehicles. And by 2030, we think that California needs to have at least 7 million passenger vehicles on the roads. That's about 24% of the light-duty vehicle population at that time forecasted. We also think that medium heavy-duty trucks need to start transitioning to electricity. And that's really important here in Southern California because they are disproportionately the source of the poor air quality here in our region. And you can see that especially along the freight corridors like the 710 leaving the ports of LA and Long Beach. So automakers and equipment manufacturers have already seen that the future is electric. You know, you have GM, Volvo, Mercedes, et cetera. They've all committed to either creating an all-electric fleet or having an electric option for every one of their models. We're also seeing cities create policies to move away from gasoline-powered vehicles. Paris and LA are two examples of that, where they've talked about banning gasoline-powered vehicles in portions of the city by 2030. But 7 million vehicles is a long way from the 300,000 we have today. And it really makes us think about how do we place the charging infrastructure we're going to need to power all those vehicles. We think they're going to be needed in a lot more places than they're available today, right? Homes, businesses, apartment complexes, and also gas stations, for instance. And they're going to need that in order to reduce the range anxiety that consumers feel today. They need to be comfortable that they can find fuel, electric fuel, when they need it. And we're seeing some of the industries looking at that seriously today. So for instance, BP is talking to automakers about putting charging at their gas stations. And Shell is already installing charging stations at some of their sites in Europe. So electrifying transportation will dramatically reduce the transportation sector's 39% GHG emissions and also improve air quality. Now let's talk about buildings. So building electrification, you can see that earlier that buildings don't have the largest greenhouse gas impact, but they use fossil fuels for space and water heating, and there really is no need for that. And I think that's really key. As you think about the future, if there is an affordable alternative, why aren't we using it? And I think we can provide new standards and incentives to electrify up to 1/3 of all new space and water heating in California, and also double energy efficiency in homes and businesses, which is already part of California standards. So it's doable, and we can make that happen if we all work together. And so by making that happen, by cleaning the electric grid, by electrifying everything, as Harry just talked about, we will meet the state's goal for 2030. And I think more importantly, we recognize that we're going to create healthier communities in California. Now, I'd be lying if I said that electric utilities don't stand to benefit from all that electrification. But I also want to make it clear that this isn't about profit only. There is a higher purpose. We realize that we will provide an essential service to our customers. And the future that we see here is providing it in a even more integral way to the economy of California. So it really is about making the world a better place. It's about helping California achieve its goals, and it's about doing that in the most affordable, practical way. So the toughest part, as I mentioned, is doing that in 12 years. If we really want to reach a state goal, it's not that far away. It's the blink of an eye. And so we need to start now, in our opinion, down that pathway. Actually, we need to start yesterday down that pathway. We need to form partnerships in each industry. We need legislators and regulators to make timely decisions. We need a significant and speedy infrastructure investment, and we need market transformation. So just for a second, if you can imagine a world where the energy that powers our lives and propels us forward is all from the Earth's resources, that future is possible. We hope that you'll join us, share your concerns, tell us what you like, and we want to work together to make sure that no community is left behind, because that is the clean energy pathway, and we're in it together. So, thank you.
A couple of questions, Caroline.
I was trying to get off the stage.
I know. What's it going to cost to create all this new infrastructure?
So we assume a couple things in our study. We assume the cap and trade program that California just extended to 2030. We assume that the Air Resources Board plan goes into effect. So at the end of all that, there is a cost.
I assume it starts with a B.
Well, I'm talking about just at the average customer level. We looked at from the customer perspective, and we projected that the average electric customer, and who was that today, and who was that going to be in 2030, but the average electric customer would see a bill increase of about $22 a month. But that would be offset by lower energy usage elsewhere, right? So less gasoline, less natural gas, and that sort of thing. So we do see overall benefit to going this direction. All of it's going to cost money, and this is the lowest cost way to get there.
And finally, it looks like a lot of behavior modification needs to happen, but people already have a lot of solar power. In fact, there's excess solar power. So how do we not waste that?
Yeah. Well, storage is definitely part of the solution to integrating that renewable energy.
Are you working on storage?
We're working on storage. I mean, some of the things that you're going to hear next and what Harry's talking about is to use some of that cheaper solar power in the middle of the day because you have so much of it. So excess supply lowers the price. We need to leverage that. And all those cars, with the right pricing design, they'll be charging in the middle of the day, taking advantage of the lower cost energy.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Caroline Choi, thank you very much. Finally, this crazy thing coming out of this company you're going to hear from now. California, among many things, is the #1 dairy state. We got a lot of happy cows in California. And I cover agriculture for CNBC. Agricultural methane is no joke when it comes to global warming. New Light Technologies in Orange County has figured out a way to take that methane and turn it into a type of plastic which is biodegradable and cheaper, allegedly. We're going to hear more about it. Their Air Carbon product, which is out there now, won Popular Science's Innovation of the Year in 2014. I cannot wait to hear more about this. Here's CEO Mark Harama.
Allegedly. All right, so June 7th, 2003 was a day that changed my life forever. At the time I was studying at Princeton, I was planning to go to medical school. The year before I had gotten very sick. And so I had sort of spent about a year going in and out of hospitals, trying to figure out what was going on with my body. And so I had developed sort of a strong sort of bent for looking for sort of science articles and things. And I came across this article, June 7th. It was called Getting the Cows to Cool It by Gary Polakovic in the LA Times. So here's our cow here. I don't know if it's the same cow. But so there were two really, really interesting things in this news article that I didn't know. The first one was about 99% of all methane that comes from cows comes from burps. Didn't know that. The second one was each dairy cow emits approximately 600 liters of methane per day. Well, that's really fascinating because now you can start to do some math, right? If you know that each dairy cow emits 600 liters of methane per day, you can say, well, I just drove by a 1,000-cow dairy farm. I can figure out exactly how much methane goes into the air every single day. And so this started a chain of questions. Well, if one farm produces X amount of gas, and we can calculate exactly how much value that is going into the air, what about all the gas that's coming out of landfills? And what about all the gas that we're flaring in places like Texas and North Dakota, places that you can see from space? It looks like New York City or Chicago from space. It's in the middle of Texas or North Dakota. And then we started to say, well, if there's all that mass, that material coming out of farms and landfills, flare stations, what about power plants? And I know all of us know about climate change and we hear these big, big numbers, but if you're like me, on some level it becomes very abstract, right? It's hard to really feel the tangible nature of what's happening. But for some reason, because of this article, I finally felt or had some glimpse of what was tangible and what was going on. And the big difference for me was not so much looking at it and saying, well, how do we get rid of this problem? Because at the time in 2003, we were mostly talking about taxing it or putting carbon emissions underground. It was, wait a minute, if you have a farm that's emitting so much methane and it has so much value, what if we looked at greenhouse gas as a source of value, right? So, I mean, fire is a good analog. Fire is something that's so destructive, but fire is also the thing that heats our food and on some level provides our old power, but it's done so much good for the world also. And so many things in life have this sort of good and bad trait. So what if there's something good in greenhouse gas? And if you look at nature, these trees here, they're made by pulling carbon dioxide out of the air. That's the mass used to make those trees. Coral reefs, same thing. It's made by pulling carbon dioxide directly out of the water. So CO2 plays a major role. I mean, it's the backbone of how nature grows. But so is methane. So methane, if you look at the bottom of the ocean, there's whole communities that they're growing using methane as the energy and carbon source. In fact, during the BP oil spill, so much of the methane that was emitted actually didn't make it to the surface because microorganisms took it up. So we started this chain of thinking saying, well, what if we could use greenhouse gas as a resource? Stop talking about taxing it necessarily or putting it underground. Those are valuable, but what if we could use it as a resource? Because if we can do that, what if we had a world where people were competing for the use of greenhouse gas in the same way that we compete for fossil fuels today? So this was our basic premise. What if we could take carbon emissions and turn them into a biomaterial that had value? I'll get into that in a second. We obviously have an abundant resource, and maybe we could be cost advantaged because we're producing so much of this material. So what we discovered was that we weren't the first people to have this idea. The concept of turning carbon emissions into biomaterials, particularly to replace plastics, was not new. But despite about 30 years of effort, each group had come across these two main challenges, and that was price and performance, and price being the biggest. And this really came down to yield. And basically, when you tried to carry out this conversion process, the overall yield was so low that it was just very, very expensive. Plastics are a commodities industry. If you're more expensive, you're simply not going to sell that material, regardless of how much people want to do something good. A great example, and we'll talk about IKEA in a little bit, but they're on pace to consume about 2 billion pounds per year of plastic. So you can imagine if you're talking about increasing pricing by 5 or 10 cents, it's a total non-starter. So 3x more expensive than plastics, it was just a curiosity. Performance was also a major challenge. So even if you had a way to produce it cost effectively, this stuff just didn't work very well. So this is where we started. This was our founding challenge. And this was our first laboratory in 2005, where we started to carry out the conversion process on a small scale. After about a year here, we moved into our first pilot plant. And I love this picture, particularly what you'll see in a little bit here, because I love looking at this empty room. It's a reminder of where we started, and in many ways, if you look about how heady this climate change challenge is, it seems impossible on so many levels, but it's not. Everything starts somewhere, right? So we started here. Then we started to build out this plant. This was our first pilot production line. We completed this in 2007, and this is what it looked like when it was complete. Unfortunately, when we went to scale this up, our economics still weren't there. We still needed to go further to make this competitive with oil-based plastics. So a number of years passed, and about 7 years after we were founded, we had our major breakthrough. And the big breakthrough was on yield. So in the past, it took about 1 kilogram of biocatalyst, which is basically microorganisms, to produce about 1 kilogram of this biomaterial. Unfortunately, at that yield ratio, 1-to-1 yield ratio, it was simply too expensive. What we figured out how to do was to build a new kind of biocatalyst that was essentially blind to the amount of polymer that it was producing, so it wouldn't turn itself off. And when we did that, we were able to achieve ratios that had never been done before. Our first was going from 1-to-1 to 1-to-3, and finally we were able to get up to about 1-to-9. So what that means is for the same input, same biocatalyst input, we're now producing 9 times more material than had ever been done previously. So you can imagine the impact that this had on our overall economics, and you can actually see it very physically. So the picture that you see here on your left, that's our first generation pilot production line prior to the yield breakthrough. After the yield breakthrough, we went from 150 feet in length to about 30 feet in length, 6 unit operations to 2, and our CapEx dropped by a factor of 5x, obviously a major impact. So finally now, after 7 years of work on this, we had a platform where at large scale, projected, we have the ability to outcompete oil-based plastics on a cost basis. So we optimized over a number of years. Finally, we were able to figure out many of the performance challenges. This is a day when we started to finally produce our first furniture at meaningful scale. Many years of development to make that actually work. We started to produce parts and pieces. In 2013, we scaled this technology up to small commercial scale. So this is at a facility in Central California. This reactor is about 50 feet tall. Certainly a very, very satisfying moment after starting with a reactor that we could hold in our hands. And we were able to produce this as one of our first products. So this chair is made almost exclusively from air and methane from a dairy farm. This, as Jane mentioned, went on to win Innovation of the Year in Popular Science, and a number of companies started to follow suit. So Dell launched their first packaging made with air carbon. Hewlett-Packard followed shortly thereafter. We started to make cell phone cases for companies like Virgin and Sprint. What we're trying to do is show that this material, which I'm holding here, can be used in multiple large global scale markets. And all of this resulted in a fairly significant uptick in demand. Since 2015, we've now contracted over 74 billion pounds of air carbon, including a 10 billion pound agreement with IKEA, 45 billion pound with a biotech company called POC, and a 19 billion pound agreement with a company called Vinmar. So this has all led us to where we are today. At 9:05 a.m. yesterday morning, we turned on our first production line at our brand new commercial production facility in Orange County, California. This is the picture of the plant here, and hopefully you remember the slide I showed you earlier. So for about a decade, we were in a very, very small, nondescript building, just trying our best. This plant we just opened up. Yesterday morning, we finally had our first line go online, so it's tremendously exciting. This facility serves as what we hope will be the springboard for something really important. What we're trying to do is show that greenhouse gas can be used as a new resource. And if we can show that that resource can be used to produce high-value products, we think that we can start to harness the market itself. Right? The market created this problem, right? We all contributed to it. But that means that we can also fix the problem together. And we think that if we can compete for greenhouse gas, use it as a high-value resource, we have a chance to make a big dent in the issue. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
A couple of questions. How much did it cost to get where you are, and where'd you get the investment?
So we've raised about $60 million to date. That includes our largest raise to date as of last year. That's enabling us to build that commercial plant. I'll never forget our very first check for $25,000. I was living with the parents after I graduated from college. Our co-founder, Kenton, was a hotel valet. I was a bellhop. And then we drive out at night to our laboratory. So that's where things started. So nothing but so much appreciation for the capital that's got into it. It started friends and family, that eventually grew into angel investors, and then corporate, strategic, and private equity. So
are you profitable or cash flow positive? Or?
We're expecting to go to profitability fairly soon.
What's your biggest challenge?
Right now, the thing that keeps me up at night is speed. You don't mean that literally, that the speed keeps you up at night.
Because this is Hollywood.
No, I mean it literally. This is heavy manufacturing. This is not, we can't write an app and overnight all of a sudden these things come online. These plants take months to design, months to install, months to bring online. So it's an intensive process. What we're trying to figure out now, though, is strategic deployment, right? So if you have a technology, if we're building plant and then plant and then plant, that's going to take a long time. So things like our license agreement with IKEA, the way that deal works is we've given them a production license to build their own facilities, to make their own tables and chairs out of air carbon themselves.
Wow.
That's a scalable approach. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to do to really get this technology out there.
You hiring?
We are. We've doubled in the past year.
40 employees, I think you said.
We're at about 40 employees. So we're hiring at a pretty good clip right now.
Mark Harriman, thank you very much. Good luck. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to all our panelists, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.